Hello, everyone, and thanks, Britt, for the introduction. My name is David from Format AI, and I will be hosting the session today. The session today is all about change, and obviously it's the month of June, and so we're partway through most people's fiscal years, and the world may look very different today compared to when we started the year and when we were planning for this year. And so, making a change midway through, as we all know, can make all the difference between, hitting your number and falling short. And so the session today is going to focus on how to recognize when a course correction is needed and what actions need to take place to keep revenue on track. And so to help with the discussion today, we have three guests that I will ask to introduce themselves. We have Dal Sidhu from Zoom, we have Elizabeth Walgram from Siemens, and James Jackson from Snowflake. And so I'll ask them to turn their cameras on right now. And perhaps, Dal, I will start with yourself to give a brief introduction.
Yeah, thank you, David. So Dal Sidhu, I'm the head of global sales compensation here at Zoom. I've been in the tech industry for 25 years now. Half of that time has been in sales compensation, and I'm very happy to be here and talk about this topic.
Great. And Elizabeth?
Hi everyone, Elizabeth Walgram here from Siemens. I've been at Siemens for about 2.5 years now, leading the global sales compensation with a great team of colleagues for DI automation, and been in sales compensation and compensation field in general for over 15 years. So really happy to be here.
Great. Thanks. And James?
Hey everyone, James Jackson. Nice to meet everyone. I'm at Snowflake. I lead our global sales comp and planning org, and I've been in sales ops, comp planning for past a little bit over a decade. Did everything from field ops to even carrying the bag for a little bit in sales. So super excited to be here.
Great. So I'd like to start the discussion today with, again, as I kind of set up the conversation before, of saying we're midway through the year. Sales plan has been, in play for a number of months now. How does someone monitor and detect, to try and understand that they're off track? Like, how do you how does that trigger get flipped? And what are you looking at? What kind of tech are you using to look at it? And essentially, how does it work through the year on a cyclical basis? And maybe I can start with yourself, Elizabeth, to kick us off.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and the answer to it, I think, is complex because there's a lot of different things that you could really be looking at. I would say that when we think about sales compensation, and in our team, we like to think of a multi-pronged approach. The information is coming from multiple sources, and you really need to be looking at various items to get the full picture. I would say two areas where we like to focus on and really keep track of on a fairly regular basis, which really requires partnerships for us, especially at the global level, is finance and then sales ops. So I'm sure my colleagues here, Dal and James, will have a little bit more to add on those fronts too. But I would say financial perspective is really important. So how are you tracking from a perspective of orders, of revenue, of cash flow? Are you there where you want it to be at the given time frame of the year? And for companies like us, where, for example, we might use seasonality, it's not necessarily just a linear view of, am I at 6 months of my goal or so on. But generally accounting for how much I think you would expect to have at this point. And then from sales ops, I think looking at things like pipeline, the distribution of performance against quota, and all of those things, I think are important metrics. And the better tools you have, obviously, to be able to track those, then the more accurate and timely prediction you can have. But I'm sure James and Dal, you probably have similar thoughts, or hopefully you do something similar.
Yeah, I mean, look, happy to share some thoughts. The way I think about it in my mind, there's leading and lagging indicators, right? And taking a step back, sales comp is the expression of what ELT wants and the stage of growth of the company, right? When you're in a growth stage company, the focus is on gross new ARR, MRR, those types of values. Growth companies purposely have built out winners and losers, right? So there's a very different distribution when you think about whether to replan or not in a growth stage company versus a more mature company, which is more about protecting the base. And that's where you're looking at retention, TCV, those types of measures that are around, negotiating that contract with your account. So on the leading side, to me, there's pipeline, pipe gen, there's forecasted attainments, mean, median, and within pipeline, you have create and close pipeline, lock-in pipe, renewal pull forwards, on that side. On lagging, right, you're looking at attainment. A lot of companies, I would say, generally are looking at 50% of reps to be hitting. To Elizabeth's point, per seasonality, it's not peanut butter spread, right? It's usually 40, 60 or whatever, H1, H2. But you're looking at like how many of my reps are hitting, what's the mean versus median, or are we, if it's a winners losers comp plan, you should have reps making 200 to 300%. You should have reps that are making 20, 30%, right? If it's a more stability growth, comp plan, you should have more folks in the middle. You shouldn't see as many outliers above and below, right? And so double check your linearity. Also make sure you're looking at your role type. If you have a hunter-farmer structure at your company, hunter is by design a spiky business. There are reps that are going to make 200, 300, 400%, reps that are going to make zero if they haven't landed a net new logo, versus expansion, which is more kind of farming. But in my perspective, those are the things that I'm looking at, right? Leading, lagging indicators, what do the win rates look like, deal size, attainments, primary versus secondary attainment. I always joke, you don't want to eat too much dessert. You want to make sure they're making it through their primary metrics and not secondary spiffs. And to me, like those are the things you want to be looking at, from a comp perspective.
Yeah, I would agree with Elizabeth and James as well. You got the internal metrics and, whether your business is changing from a strategic standpoint, right? Like if your executive is saying, hey, we're shifting focus a little bit. Those are definitely areas that you want to kind of keep in line with, your compensation strategies. Like if the focus of the organization is changing, is your compensation structured in a way that's going to make sure that you're now focusing on the new direction? You also want to kind of think about, external factors as well, right? A few years back, we had the COVID situation. So obviously that was going to create a different dynamic with a lot of companies. Nowadays, we've got, the new government in place in the United States, right? So they're making a lot of decisions that's going to affect a lot of businesses. We also got situations in war in the Middle East and, Russia and Ukraine, which has been going on for several years. So you got to look at those impacts on not only what are the external impacts of your business, and whether there's course correction that is happening with your business that you then need to think about, well, now how do those changes now impact your compensation? So as well as the internal factors, there's also the external factors that shouldn't be ignored, right? Those are always going to have an impact, but you also you need to really think about, like, are those a long-term scenario, medium-term, short-term, right? And before you do some knee-jerk reaction and make some drastic changes as well.
Yeah, I really like the thought about considering external factors, because I think the last 5 years that we've been in business in the United States have been pretty extraordinary. When I look back to my days in sales compensation and compensation in general, prior to 5 years ago, a lot of it was more predictable, more business as usual, whether it was from a general compensation perspective. You always expected this much merit. You always expected a certain type of distribution curve for sales people, the type of things that we would need to be thinking about and how often we would need to be checking on things were at a slightly slower pace, I would say, and there was a lot more predictability. I think ever since the decade started, we've been seeing a lot more upheaval and a lot more change. And what's this creating is a lot more difficult of a job for sales operations and sales management when they are thinking about goals, and how also that disseminates into then strategically designing incentive plans, designing territories, and really everything else that kind of feeds into this whole cycle that ultimately comes into how you pay a salesperson. And what that really means is that you do need to be looking at those leading and lagging indicators more often. You do need to be thinking about, am I seeing any trends? Am I potentially needing to start thinking about change that might be coming down my pipeline? I don't think we're at a stage right now, given all these external factors, where we can be giving ourselves a lot of wait and see type of attitude, but we need to be thinking a lot more proactively and more real time data and tracking. So I think, Dal, you made a really good point. It's not just the internal view, the external view is putting us in a situation where the internal workings are becoming even more important.
And I'll throw another one out there. Like, I think everybody's in the whole AI spectrum right now, right? Some people are further ahead than others. Some people are still trying to understand, well, how that can affect the business. And not even just like how you operate internally, but how you're gonna work with your customers. So the predictability, as you mentioned, Elizabeth, like it's starting to get really, really murky with AI because nobody really knows how it's gonna transform how businesses are gonna operate. And I think it's exciting, but also a little scary at the same time, right? Because it can shift so quickly, almost, month to month, week to week, month to month, is as a compensation expert, you need to then start looking at, okay, if this shift is going to happen, can you quickly evolve and move in the direction of now a new dynamic, which can be like AI, agentic AI, whatever it may be, and that future, because it's so quick now. Like we were talking about conversational AI 6 to 8 months ago, and now we're talking about agentic AI. They're talking about other type of AI now as well. It's evolving so fast.
Yeah, I think it's a good call out. One more thing I would add to that, I think there's a lot of known unknowns, and to both of your points, right? Like we don't know the exact extent of some of these extrinsic values and how it's going to impact from a comp quota perspective. One thing I will also add is, it's really the comms, right? When I joined Snowflake, it was a little bit of a black box in how comp was designed. I don't know if any of you guys have that experience where the feedback from the field is this a black box?
Yep.
The high table provides these numbers and quotas, and we have to go in. I used to be in sales, and we had a saying in enterprise sales, which was, all hands on the murder weapon. And what that means is like, look, let's get feedback. Let's hear directly from sales what's working, what's not working. And I will never forget this. We did this huge shift from kind of, a more of a protect the base comp plan at Snowflake to a much more aggressive, assertive comp plan focused on more like incremental type measures and consumption and bookings and those types of things. And we did all these workshops in London, in different parts of the US and APJ. And the first slide, when we actually rolled out the new comp plan, is we said, hey, this is what we heard from you on the left, as a left-right slide. On the right, here's how we fixed it, right? We heard these were the complaints. This is how we changed the comp plans. And whether or not, we have some success with it, but when you play back psychologically, you play back the feedback that sales has been complaining about, it really deflates the balloon. It really helps add some credibility, because that's something, it is I don't want to be negative. Sometimes sales comp can be a thankless job, right? When things are going well, you don't hear anything. When things are not going well, you hear an earful from from all directions, from ELT, from sales, all over the place. So to me, like that's one of my guiding principles is make sure you communicate and play back the feedback and make sure that you're tight on everyone's on the same page with why we designed the comp plan the way we did. So you may not agree with it, right? But we heard your feedback along the way.
Our team likes to joke that we have the second hardest job in the company.
I was going to ask a couple follow-ups based on what you guys have said. And I'm picking up on something, Elizabeth, you mentioned in terms of the financial metrics that you're evaluating and looking at versus maybe the more sales ops related ones. And I guess maybe a question to all three of you guys, has there ever been cases in your experience where those two are telling a different story, right? Where, sometimes you think that, the plan should be designed to hit a lot of the financial objectives of the company. But is there ever a time where you're looking at your financial objectives, you're off track, but maybe your sales ops metrics are on track. You know, your distributions are nice and normal. They're around 100%. You feel like you're on target. Curious if they're always telling the same story.
I think it depends on how closely linked your sales incentive plan is with the financials in terms of metrics, and also how many metrics you have in general. So let me give you a simple example. If you have a plan that is focused, let's say, on just one metric for the salespeople, but you are tracking as a company for financial purposes 4 or 5 other metrics that matter. Your salespeople could be doing very well, and the company could not be doing just so, or vice versa, right? So if you, and the best example is, let's say you have only orders that you're looking for. Well, if you only as a salesperson worry about orders, then you might not worry about profit or revenue or something else like product mix. And if you do have all of these metrics, then the salesperson is going to be worried about everything. But on the flip side, they might not have influence or line of sight towards everything. So there's a little bit of a balance, I think, that you have to think about when we design sales incentive plans. You have to make it simple enough that you get enough of the focus of the salesperson so that they are aligned with how the company is performing, and you do have that link. But on the flip side, you can't also be putting everything in the kitchen sink for the salesperson to be worrying about, because at the end of the day, their job is to sell, and they can't influence everything. So that's why I think it's really important to be looking multidimensionally. You can't be just focusing on leading or only on lagging or only on financials or only on pipeline, because everyone in the organization that ultimately influences that big one goal at the end will be able to have line of sight on different things.
Great. We've also had a couple questions come in that I think would be good to answer for the entire audience. So one, Dal, specifically to you, is that have you seen any requirement for more frequent mid-year changes in the last few years relative to perhaps earlier than that?
Well, our comp plans are, so at Zoom, we did 3 month to 6 month comp plans. We kind of transitioned more to 6 month comp plans. So we did have the ability to make some changes if need be, because, we were coming off the whole COVID situation, and we had to kind of make some changes. So because we were on a more frequent comp structure, it gave us that flexibility. Now we're in more of a stable environment. So, we're not making as many changes, or we move more to a 6 month comp plan structure. But really what you want to look at is you want to separate the noise from the signals, right? And there is a lot of noise externally and internally, right? You need to kind of really think about, well, what's really going to have a direct impact on the sellers and how they achieve their targets, right? So even with the frequency and the plan structure, you don't want to get into a situation where you're making changes just because of the noise, right? You need to be able to kind of make sure you've got all your data points in place, right? So that you can then say, oh, okay, well, yeah, this signal is very strong. We do need to take some directive action here, versus like, we might want to do a wait and see situation in some of these instances as well.
And James, I know that you answered one in the chat, but I think it would be good maybe to elaborate for the rest of the audience in case not everyone's reading it, because I think your answer was excellent. So, we had a follow-up question to what you mentioned earlier on that slide that you created in terms of, we heard this is how we fixed it. The question was really, is there anything that you avoid putting up on that slide because you didn't address that change?
Yeah, I mean, look, guys. Unfortunately, not all voices are equal, right? When you have these sales feedback sessions, make sure you're being very selective with who's in there. I think some people do provide constructive feedback, some are less constructive, and so you have to kind of sort through which are the good. You'll kind of know which are the good sales leaders, which are not the good sales leaders. But it's funny, right? sales comp, I've always said this, sales comp should be the expression of the strategy that ELT is trying to deliver on. And ELT doesn't always know or have, the same perspective, right? And so, we had a C-suite executive publicly say at SCO, hey, 10% of our reps are going to make $1 million this year, right? I want to see you guys make $1 million. And I'm getting escalations. Like I have I have a call on Monday with a first-line sales leader that's saying, James, this person said I was supposed to make $1 million. I don't see my path to make the $1 million. Like, help me explain, like, what went wrong with my comp plan? Like, I was supposed to make $1 million, and this is like serious, right? Like, earnestly, So, I think there's always, I always like to harken back to these are our comp principles, right? 50% of reps hit their quota. I don't know, not 80% mean attainment, whatever, right? Like, we need to harken back to what those principles are, why we designed it the way we did, and we have to explain a little bit of the why. And I tell sales leaders, look, we're not going to always agree on everything, right? But if we can align on these principles and make sure we're on the same page, that's what's important. But yeah, there's a reason why we're in the roles that we're in. Sometimes we have to make the difficult decisions. And one more note, right? Like, I don't know about you guys, we always have to work with finance on budgeting for the comp plan, right? Like, for sure, I want everyone to make lots of money, but we have an affordability that we have to run through, and we have to simulate, what it's going to look like. And we have to be flexible. We have to be able to make adjustments. They're not always popular, but you have to make sure everyone's on the same page when you're making these decisions. We have to have each other's back. Like that's what's important between sales leadership and finance, that everyone's on the same page.
Yeah, I would second what both James you mentioned and Dal as well. Setting the expectations is really key because to the point of noise versus signal, the reality is that not everybody's going to achieve their quota. The reality is if too many people are achieving the quota, there's something wrong either with the plan or with the quotas themselves. That means we haven't really set them correctly. Even on a time frame, if you've done everything correctly, the right plan in place, the right quotas, the right target setting in place, you still will not always have the same distribution from year to year. On probably a 10-year period, you should be expecting 1 to 2 years that everybody's going to be doing really well. You're going to see on average that pretty high, over 100% achievement. You're probably going to have 2 years where you're going to be seeing that people are, majority of them, not really hitting the quota. And then the rest of the years are probably going to be someplace in between where you're going to have a much cleaner distribution. So that type of expectation setting that not everybody's going to be doing well, and even collectively we're not always going to be doing well, is important because that tells you whether you should really be going down the direction of making any adjustments to your quotas mid-year or changing really any type of philosophies or approaches in general.
And I just want to reiterate what Elizabeth and James said, expectations and the why. Like, those two things are so important when you're doing the communication, whether you're doing a mid-period chain, whether you're doing a chain at the beginning of the year, any chain in terms of compensation, because everybody's going to think that is personal, right? You're making it harder for me to achieve my money. You made it difficult for me as a salesperson. But at the end of the day, really, it's not about you, it's about the business, right? And I think reiterating why we're doing it, setting the right expectations, and being very, very clear around how they can still earn money. It might not be the same amount that they earned last year, but they still have the ability to earn as long as they're producing. Like, I think everybody in this world, everybody knows that you want to be paid for performance, right? If your comp plan is not structured for pay for performance, then you have a problem with your comp plan. But as long as your philosophy, your number one philosophy is pay for performance, then the why and setting the expectations becomes easier, right? And explaining it becomes a little bit easier. But your North Star really should be, this is what the company has to do, right? Number one, we want to focus on the customer. Number two, we need to focus on the company. Number three is actually you, right? And framing up in those three things and making sure that becomes part of your philosophy and be able to communicate the why and expectations based on those three things, then people really get to understand, right? I came from an environment where we weren't as transparent around compensation. You know, James, when he said, hey, it's black box, we weren't as transparent. And then when I came to Zoom about 4 years ago, I would, it was a situation where I wouldn't be totally clear. And people were like, why don't you just tell us what it is? So I'm like, all right, fine. I'm just going to tell you the good and the bad and ugly. And then you guys can decipher how you guys want to hear it. And they were very appreciative of that, that it became more transparent and wasn't a black box. And now you're really concentrating on the why, and then they can set the expectations down to their sales rep level as well, right? So just want to make sure that's clear. Like that is so important that you communicate the why and very clear on the why.
And continue on the topic. I think, Dal, you've created a lot of noise about the signal and the noise. So there's another question that just came in directed towards you, that I think is very interesting. And the question is, how should responsibility be assigned or divided for teams that are distilling that or separating that noise from the signal between biz ops, strategy, analytics, comp? Um, yeah, like how does that, who's in charge of figuring that out? And I assume it's a little bit of everyone.
It is a little bit of everyone. And it's a great question, by the way. It is a little bit of everyone, right? And in this scenario, when this type of things happen, it's about listening, right? Getting people's perspective, right? And if you're in charge of the compensation and you're getting, hey, we're hearing about this, we're hearing about that, let's get the facts, right? Make sure you're working on the facts. And once you get the facts, then you can start saying, all right, we're going to now look at it, look at the problem and say, this group is going to be responsible for that. This group is going to be responsible for that. But before you even get to that level, you need to have an executive sponsor. An executive sponsor has to say, yes, this signal is strong enough for us to now consider something different, right? Because if the noise is just at the field level and is not coming from the executive level, you're going to get stuck in between, right? So if that signal is coming from the top, then it becomes a priority. Now, once that becomes a priority, then you can start seeing, all right, where does it really fall in terms of responsibility of the different teams that are involved, right? Compensation is going to be at the hub, right? They're going to be in the middle because everything relates. At the end of the day, you're trying to change behavior. You're trying to motivate the sales organization. You're trying to make sure that the company strategy around driving growth, is at the forefront. So that, it becomes a center point, but you need to work with all the other groups as part of your ecosystem, as part of your compensation ecosystem to make sure that you're able to separate and distill where you want to really create that focus.
We have another, I think, interesting question on monitoring new sales plans. So again, I'm sure you guys in your experience have encountered where, instances where you're making a gigantic change year over year. Is there a different approach when that's happening in terms of your always on monitoring throughout the year, to make sure, I don't know, maybe those changes are actually effective, if they're going to pay out properly, if you're going to blow the budget?
Is that a question, David, around like a new team, a new plan structure?
It was specifically mentioned in terms of moving, like switching from commission rates to quota, but I'm sure it could be just like totally switching up metrics, paying on ARR versus some other metric year over year.
Mhm.
Yeah, I can start. I mean, look, we do a ton of Monte Carlo simulation. So we rolled out new metrics. This was something we've not done before. And so what we do is we look like, look, we've never run these metrics before. If we had run them last year, what would that comp distribution, attainment distribution had looked like? And so you can do some historical view. It's obviously it's not perfect because seller behavior will change with new comp measures, but you can do Monte Carlo simulation to kind of run a couple of runs where you look at what that distribution looks like. It's interesting, and I have this more around the sales engineering org, less from sales. But sometimes in some companies, you'll have AEs on individual plans, and you have sales engineers. But if the product is not as technical, they'll be on a pooled model, so they'll be covering 6 or 7 AEs, right? If it's a technical product, like you're at a Cisco or Google Cloud, it's 1-to-1. But DocuSign, for instance, that was 1-to-6 or whatever. It's a pooled model. That will be more of a team quota. And the argument I get all the time from SE leaders on comp plans is, hey, why is my payout rate for bonuses half the payout rate for an AE? And I say, look, an AE is on 50-50, you're on 75-25. They are 2x more leverage than you are. And that's why the payout rate reflects the risk in the comp plan, right? And so the pooled model versus individual, to me, that's the other thing you look at is pooled is going to be less upside, less downside. Same thing for a first or second line sales leader, right? You're not going to have the highs and lows as much. You're kind of one middle, but that's like intrinsic in how the comp plan is a feature, not a bug. And so I always like to, it's something you're always going to have to deal with, right? When you have SEs, or you have folks that are on individual versus, team plans, that is the design. And you need to make sure sales leadership, SE leadership is aligned. If we go this route, this is the consequence of the route, the good and the bad, right? No one's ever going to be happy. You're always going to have people that are not happy with, they want an individual on this deal, but they want a team on this other part of the comp plan. Like it's one or the other, right? You can't pick and choose on that side. So that's my only thought is I do think you can do analysis historically. We're rolling out 2-year plans for the first time. It's really exciting. We actually are giving for our upmarket acquisition reps actually a 2-year window to hit their number. So those are things that we're experimenting with, and I recommend, right? Have a perspective, make sure you're not breaking too many rules, and monitor and have your red lines on, when you will pull the plug if it's not working.
When I hear about monitoring and switching between plan types, such as commission to bonus, or making bigger changes to plans, one of the things that I would point out to is that making the change is fine, but just make sure that the change you're making is purposeful. So have a really clear idea why you're doing it and what you want to accomplish with it. So the worst thing you can do is, for example, somebody says, oh, I've heard my competitor is doing this, or I've heard this type of plan is better, or I've heard in another part of our organization, they have this type of plan and they're earning a lot of money. We should go down that route. Because the design of the plans, and whether you choose a commission, how you design a payout curve, whether you have a bonus and so on, has to really tie with individual aspects of your go-to market, and also can tie with a lot of different things within your organization. So something even as small as, in one part of organization or for product line, you might have a different profit margin than in another, and that in itself could cause you to look at the pay curve and leverage the pay mix in a very different way. Once you do make those type of changes, I would also usually caution from doing a whiplash type of approach. So don't put in a plan and then a year later completely change it, and then a year later go back. It creates a nightmare in terms of communication, really erodes a lot of trust from the sales force, and thinking that the leadership knows what they're doing if you make dramatic changes like that. So you really have to be cautious about putting something new in place with purpose, likely for a generally longer amount of time. It's okay to be making smaller tweaks, because your go-to-market, especially in the very dynamic world, is going to be changing, and you do need to be reacting. So the plan doesn't need to stay static, but whatever you do, don't try to make it without a good reason, and don't try to change it, I would say, too often on a fundamental level.
Yeah, I had one of our CRO, my recent CRO, he made a really, really good comment the other day. He said, measure twice, cut once. But basically mean like make sure you do enough due diligence, because once you make that cut, once you make that communication, it's very hard to kind of reverse back, right? And as we all know, when we talk about international businesses, workers' council, right? And you're trying to give bad news, very difficult to do that. So it's important that when you are doing your planning, measuring twice, doing the modeling, make sure you look at different scenarios, do some what ifs that are extreme, do some what ifs that are, not as extreme, have a range, and then, provide that information to your executives to make that decision before you kind of pull the trigger on that next change.
I'm gonna jump back to just one last thing before we jump onto the next topic. But James, you specifically mentioned, difficulty and perhaps predicting or monitoring the performance of hunters or maybe enterprise reps who are hunting these large accounts and obviously more sporadic performance. The answer just might be it's really hard, but I wanted to ask the question is that what is a way that you can, are there ways to predict that or monitor throughout the year to figure out if they're offside? Is it just focusing more on those leading indicators, I assume?
Yeah, I think that's precisely correct, David. Right. Sales productivity, in a lot of companies, it's a four-letter word. But in my perspective, productivity means we're paying reps an OTE and they need to be producing things for us. Obviously, we want to see, bookings or consumption, whatever, from the company. But on these large enterprise, long pursuits, you have a rep chasing JPMC or some large bank or something. If you have a technical product that has a potentially multi-year deal cycle, also could be in the federal government. These are longer deal cycles. Enterprise and parts like regulated industries and EMEA, APJ could also be examples. I like to look at pipeline, right? What does the pipe gen look like? Does it justify, so like the 2-year plan example, does it justify a 2-year plan, right? And I've had pushback. I had someone from UK retail that said, look, we'd love to do a 2-year plan. They're hard to enter, but the ASP, the deal size is too small. And my question back is, then why are we investing in this part of the business? This vertical doesn't make sense if we're not able to get, we use a term called base commission rate, BCR, and we have a firm rule in sales comp, 25% BCR is the cut. And since reps are on 50-50 plan, basically what that means is you need to give us for every $2 we receive, we're giving you at, $1 max, right? If we're giving you more than $1, that is not a good return, right? And so those are the types of lens we look at. For sure, when there are experiments, we have to look at pipe gen. And there's a question in the chat, right? 2-year plan, it is frozen. There's no moving accounts, none of that stuff. The hypothesis behind a 2-year plan is this is a pursuit where they want a single point of contact, uninterrupted, that they're whale hunting, right? And so that is a big big hypothesis. We'll see if it works or not, but that's kind of a big thing that we've been launching.
I'm assuming with that, James, the 2-year plans are with your highest tenured sales reps.
Yes, yeah, you have this in your upmarket segment, federal reps, enterprise reps that are covering new acquisitions, like the most strategic accounts that we know it's going to take. And I don't know if you guys have seen this as well. Maybe this is an interesting question. I've had escalations from sales leaders that said, hey, I had an acquisition rep. They famine for a year, 2 years. They finally hit the number. They finally, crushed it. I want to make sure they have a super low quota. So they make a lot of money, right? Because they want to take care of their reps because they're 50-50. They didn't make money for a year, maybe 2 years. And, you're making, in tech easily 200-300K OTE. And so that they're missing out on, $200,000 to $300,000 of commissions. And so they want to spike the ball when they land a big deal, which I get. And so to me, like part of this is like resolving, because that's also not great, right? Is manipulating the quota to make sure the rep gets paid a lot when it does land. But that's kind of the situation on that side.
I always say when somebody wants to change their quota, like it has to go somewhere. So you need to figure out where it goes. Somebody's not going to be
That's right. That's right. It's funny. All the exceptions always go to bring quota down. I've yet to see an exception where they want the quota to go up. Or we got this windfall. We want some quota with it, please.
Very rarely does that happen.
I guess speaking of that quota changes, I wanted to now take the conversation to, okay, let's pretend that, we've been monitoring the plan, something has triggered where we're saying we're off course. I think there's probably definitely more, but there's probably 2 main scenarios where we're going to make a change. It could be to quota and territory, or it could be to changing the comp plan. I just wanted to ask you guys, maybe it's a high level question, but how do you do something like these are big changes, right? Changing someone's quota, changing someone's territory composition is huge. How do you go about doing it in terms of review, but also communicating to the field?
Yeah, maybe I will start. So for me, I think there's also a third aspect, David, that you didn't mention, and that's the overall territory structure. So not all companies, I guess, operate on that concept, but if you start with the thought that you first define your territory structure of accounts and go-to-market strategy without thinking about the people, but rather if I had to look blank slate, how would I organize my territories? How would I put targets on those territories? And that exists independently before you start putting on the salespeople attached to those territories. That is a third dimension. And I mentioned that because we want to keep that stable, or at least at Siemens, we have a rule that something really, really extraordinary has to happen for us to try to change that structure that we put in. The quotas we would also hope to keep pretty stable, but that I think has more leeway in when you might potentially be seeing changes. Besides your usual, turnover of people or unique situations where you might have what we call either white elephants or those type of I could not have predicted in my planning type of account coming your way. Those would be the type of situations where you would see a quota change. And sometimes you can't really pre-plan every account and every customer. So I remember a situation where we had one seller all of a sudden find themselves in a once in a 5-year type of deal. This will not happen more than that rarely. Either we sign in with like a really large data center as a customer, or we don't. And they're not going to be, re-signing every year. This is like a one huge deal. That might be something where you as a leader might then want to take the process to review. Do you give that person the full credit for that type of sale? Do you give them partial credit? Do you not give them any credit? Like how much influence did they have and so on? So that might potentially change your goals. But the comp plan, as you mentioned, is also one of those levers that we could use. And I often say that could be reserved more for situations where if you want to keep the stability of quotas and territory structure, your comp plan becomes another lever where you can be pulling it to make adjustments on a once in a year type basis without essentially moving the fundamentals around. Makes communications easier down the road as well.
Yeah. And I don't like changing quotas too much because one, I think you lose a little bit of faith in the business. And I think the sales organization starts to lose trust, right? What I like to then consider is like, okay, if we've messed with the quotas, which means if they're too high, well, why don't we look at doing uplifts or spiffs or maybe there's an opportunity for us to now think about a strategic product that we would want the sales guys to say, maybe we'd give additional quota credit for that, right? I think there's different ways to kind of manage those type of scenarios without having to redo all the comp plans and redo the quotas. And just kind of looking at like what are some other scenarios to do that versus trying to go hardcore and saying, okay, let's just change all the plans, especially if you kind of already just recently rolled it out and halfway through. If you're on a frequent cycle where your comp plans, let's say 6 months at a time, you have the ability to course correct that. If you're on a year, you might want to do some more creative stuff where it's like, oh, we'll do an uplift spiff or something like that to kind of minimize the impacts that we might have otherwise have seen.
And ideally, you also have governance around this, right? So you should have some sort of a policy document, or at least some rules of the road that talk about in situations like this is the process we follow. And these are the type of situations where we might do X, Y, and Z. In these situations, we would not do anything. And then other situations are obviously could be unique, so we might not predict them. But the more governance you put around these type of processes, the clearer it is who makes the decision, when is this decision being made, who communicates it, because otherwise you may get into a situation where one leader in one country or one division decides to do something and someone else decides not to do something, and all of a sudden you get into the challenges of unfairness where one team is helped and the other team is not.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You have to be very thoughtful, like where do you really want to place those bets? Because you're right, like one market could be doing really well, and then all of a sudden you do something for another market. It's like, hey, what about us? So
Yeah. You don't want that resentment building between
yeah.
your sales teams.
Yeah, and Joelle asked this question. I think this is a very good topic, right? Because it's a common thing that happens to all of us, which is, how do you tell that it's a performance issue or it's a macro extrinsic issue, right? So at DocuSign, right, one of our use cases we sell into is mortgage use cases in financial services. And so if you guys recall, back in 2021, 2022, interest rates went up and consumption of those products went down. And so we saw this, huge drop in consumption of certain products in certain verticals. And so it's a really good question Joe asked in the chat, which is like, hey, how do you make sure, is it performance? Is it not? Right. And I would say, look, you want to look at the data. If it's an entire team getting crushed, it could be pointing towards macro factors, right? If it's just one or two, right, you got to be looking at, how did I carve the accounts? Is there an issue with the account density, with the size of the book of business? What you don't like in a patch is where you have a lumpy account, where it's like one account makes up 80+% of the book of business. That is, flip the switch, yes or no, if they're going to hit their number or not. So you gotta play a little bit of detective. You gotta understand, what's the scenario? Is it repeatable? So Elizabeth's point, right? Is there governance? Like, do we have a process? Ideally, we have a process in place to like fairly judge this. And whenever you share a ruling on a comp escalation, I always think it's important, right? These were the factors that led to this conclusion, right? We saw this data, we saw this trend, we realized this is not unique to this individual, but to the broader team. And so if I am providing relief or I am providing adjustment, it needs to be fair across the teams impacted, right? So those are the types of things where I think you got to play a little bit of detective. And like, it also, by the way, this is important for the narrative, because when it goes to finance, when it goes potentially to ELT, and to Dahl's point, quota is the last thing you want to adjust down. It does break trust in the comp plans. It should be up to CEO level like discussion to make a big change, like a quota adjustment, right? When like the topic of this call, right, is around mid-year adjustments. This is because something really good is happening. The business is accelerating. The once in a generation plague has come in and everyone's jumping on Zoom and DocuSign, all this stuff. Or the opposite, where, hey, the business is drastically slowing down because of uncertainty in the business, to the point where we might have to readjust. If we're a public company, we might have to readjust what we're reporting to the street. Those are the types of things where you see, you see something really big happening, and that's a discussion usually with ELT, right? DocuSign, we had this happen. We saw the symptoms. We saw pipeline dropping off. We saw win rates dropping. We saw deal size dropping. All the clues were very clear that something outside of sales execution was the issue. And when we saw the projected attainment for the end of the year, instead of 80, 90%, when you start seeing 40, 50, 60% for end of the year attainment, that is a problem. And that's something that, we need, as a leadership team, we need to make, all hands on the murder weapon. We need to make sure everyone's aligned on what's the right solution. Do we all see and understand the problem the same way? And these are the levers we can pull. And the most extreme, to Dahl's point, is a replan, right, on that side.
Yeah. Hopefully your company has a risk management or a risk type of department that looks at risk from various type of angles and type of dimensions. And usually when companies do that type of risk assessments, they will use it for a broad range of decision making, whether it's what type of products they put on the market, how they go to market, what type of customers they approach. And frankly, we as sales compensation experts, as even general compensation experts or sales operation leaders, should also be tapping into that knowledge to help think, how can we use any of that research about macro trends and micro trends in our industries? How could that potentially impact us? So with any type of change that is happening, there will be some change that is going to be very sudden and you can't predict it. I don't think anybody could have predicted COVID-19 before it really hit, or some of the aspects of, how quickly the interest rates have changed. But there will be other things that will point to potential directions. We can either go this way or that way. Let's scenario plan what it could be, and that could also be helping us set the quota so that by the time that we're actually getting to rolling it out, you're thinking about what is the realistic, most probable cause that's going to be hopefully making our setting of the quotas as accurate as we possibly can in the macro environment.
And I wanted to just follow up on that because I think you guys have mentioned some really interesting points about instances, really don't want to reduce quota. There's other levers at play, SPIFs to get the sales force more money. What about the reverse situation where quotas were just not set properly? Everyone's hitting it out of the park. Are there any levers at play mid-year to protect from finance killing us because we're way, way, way over budget spend? Does it really just come down to the doing proper modeling earlier before the fiscal year, or is there anything mid-year in our toolkit?
If the sales reps are blowing out the number, I mean, the company's doing really well too.
Yep, which is great.
But like if it was seriously like in a specific pocket, it was like, hey, this quota was set incorrectly for this particular segment. A few things that you could fall back on is probably like hopefully a windfall clause that you have in your comp plans, right? Where it's like, hey, if you achieve more than 300% on a single deal, it becomes a little bit more difficult to invoke, but that would be one lever that could be used. There's rarely been an instance where I've been in the industry for a long time where I've seen blowouts, right? If it's being blowout, like the company is doing really, really well. So it's a rarity. But I would say like the one mechanism would be like a windfall.
Yeah, or plan design. For example, some companies are more risk averse than others. So you might have an uncapped plan, you might have a capped plan. A cap on an incentive plan is also going to protect you in certain ways, or even caps on payments, like if you make quarterly or monthly payment, keeping some of the acceleration until the end of the fiscal year can be protected as well, especially if the boost might happen early in the year and then all of a sudden you already paid that out and now something drops in terms of performance later on. You don't want to be in the business of doing clawbacks either. So I think there's also creative ways of structuring your incentive plans to also achieve some of that.
That's a good call out. We also do kind of like there's an excellence point where it accelerates and then it does flatten out above, like, let's say 300%. How we get around, so for instance, there might be instances, I think this was mentioned earlier, where it's a once in a lifetime huge deal, $100 million deal or whatever, right? And we do have there are ways you can play with spiffs where someone drives a big deal and you want to do a payout or potentially equity if you want the rep to stay, right? On that side. So there's ways you can play around with the rate tables as well as spiffs when it comes to like large deal management, because that is a way to kind of mitigate against runaway overpayment. Because it is a fair concern. If you have, I always like to have on the far end 300% or so, you regulate back to 1x the accelerator, so the rep's still making money and they can still like uncap to some extent, but they're not going to be making it like 3x all the way ad infinitum, right, on the side.
Yeah, we do something similar as well. Like once they get at a very high excellence level, going back to 1x, I've seen situations where drop down to 0.5 or 0.25, especially if it's if you're a specialist organization, new product, right, new business area, you could kind of put in more softer caps or harder caps, as Elizabeth has mentioned. So there are mechanisms within the plan frameworks and the pay curves that you can leverage to kind of get the same result or kind of minimize the risk, basically.
Well, we're coming to the top of the hour, and I think this is a great place to stop. There's been a great discussion and lots of really good information shared. So I wanted to thank Everyone in the chat for sending your questions. I think we almost covered them all. And I also wanted to thank Dal, James, and Elizabeth for joining today. Again, great discussion, and we really enjoyed hearing all of your experience and the key points that you made. So thanks for joining, everyone. We have 3 more sessions this week still, so I hope to see everyone in the next few. And to everyone out there, have a great day. Thank you.